Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today here at Innovate for Technology and Society by Dr. Vivienne Ming. So I see some really familiar faces in the crowd, some regular attendees of our events. That's great to see. But for those of you who might be new, don't really know what Innovate what we do. So Innovate is a startup founded for startups. We aim to help launch and scale the scientist entrepreneur. And just recently, we announced our Deep Tech Nexus strategy, where we aim to do that and contribute to the deep tech ecosystem in two main ways: through investment capital, where we aim to be one of the earliest investors, and through human capital, where we aim to build the talent network here in Singapore. And today, here, we have Dr. Vivienne Ming with us, who actually just spoke at MTech this evening. She just came here right after her talk. And one thing I remember very vividly from her talk is how C3PO won't be, if Star Wars fan out here, so C3PO won't be tapping you on the shoulder and say, you know, you're out, AI is gonna replace your job. And I'm sure she'll have much more interesting stories to share today. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Vivienne Ming.
Thank you. All right, and we got a clicker and everything. I feel like I'm gonna do a stand-up routine. So clearly false advertising. Amazingly, I didn't even have to pay that much for that photo. So it's great to be here. And in the spirit of the fact that I've actually spent a fair number of hours on stage over the last few days, I'm gonna keep this pretty open. Everyone keeps telling me that Asian audiences don't ask questions. Well, let's make that not true. And I want you to interrupt me as I go. Instead of giving a fixed talk, and I think I have one here, but there's somewhere around like your 7th talk in 3 days where you don't really remember anything that you were going to talk about. So you will be, along with me, surprised about what slides up here. And then we'll make up some fun stories about them. It'll be improvisational speaking. But the core of the story here is broadly about what it actually takes to innovate in a way that makes meaningful change in the world. It turns out coming up with a new idea is hard. It's genuinely hard. I'm not a VC. Technically, I'm a partner at some venture firm somewhere, but I'm inventing an algorithm for them to try and predict new medical technologies to save lives. And I figure if I help them invest in them, they save more lives. But I'm not really a VC. Nonetheless, I get pitched a lot of ideas. I mean a lot. Everywhere I go, someone wants me to give them feedback about their startup idea. And my most universal piece of feedback is, so I've heard this idea 100 times before, and all of those companies are out of business. And I bet you didn't know that. So I'd like you to take a month and go figure out why you're going to be different. There are no new problems. I know it feels like we can all invent these fancy new technologies and explore new spaces, and there's augmented reality, and there's virtual reality, and we just had talks about quantum computing and all these sorts of things. But technologies aren't problems, they aren't solutions, they're just tools. Fundamentally, there are human problems and there are human solutions. If you don't understand that, you cannot solve anything. And the fanciest technology in the world will not change any of that. So a lot of my job as a mentor is to wipe the smile off your face and get you to think hard about how it's going to be different this time. Now, I'm going to find out what the first slide is, and I will start making things up. Well, I don't need to make that much up there. I do have a couple of books coming out this year. One is called How to Robot-Proof Your Kids, which I'm sure explains itself, but might be a little of the content we're going to go into here. And the other is The Tax on Being Different, which is an interesting look at what happens when you take massive data sets and machine learning looking at questions of bias and inclusion. And I have some fairly interesting stories to share about that. But today, oh my goodness, so if anyone was in my audience, you saw some of these before. What I'm gonna do a little bit differently here, at the MTech thing, I just like blew through this. I wanna tell a couple stories this time. In the spirit of being like, involving the audience, pick a story. Which of these do you really wanna know? Which of these just is grabbing you in the moment and you desperately want an explanation, the story behind it? Somebody. The scatter plot. So I mentioned at MTech, if you happen to have been there, that I'm doing some work with Accenture. So the story behind this is about 2 years ago, I was approached by Amazon to be their chief scientist for people. And they had a great pitch. If you know my work, it was an amazing pitch. In 7 years, we will be a 1 million person company. And your job will be to make their life better. So I've gotten a lot of fancy job offers that I've turned down at Uber, like that was easy. And Netflix and Google and a variety of other places. But this one, like, they kind of nailed it. That's my purpose in the world, is to make better people, is to make people's lives better. And they offered me this opportunity. So I fly up to Seattle and I meet with everybody. And no shock to me, I'm a grown-up. It wasn't actually what the job would be. And in the end, I made them a counteroffer. If I can make 1 million people's lives better, I'll do it for free. Call me a fellow or something, and give me all the same data you were going to give me anyways. And I won't do what you tell me to, but everything I discover, I will share only with you. I mean, think hard about that offer. Make 1 million people's lives better. Why wouldn't I? I don't know if you know this, well, I'm going to save another story for later, but that motivates me. My life is good. I don't need Amazon's money. It would have been a lot of money, but why wouldn't I do that? They turned me down. They wanted an 80-hour-a-week executive or nothing, which, if you know Amazon, shouldn't shock you. Essentially, there's only one actual job description at Amazon, and that is do what Jeff says. And as I just shared with you, that's really, I'm not going to be successful at that job. So then this cool thing happened. Ellen Shook, who's the head of talent at Accenture, came to me and said, we're 425,000 people. Is that enough? So what you're seeing here is something that's kind of mundane. It's a social graph of Accenture, or 70,000 Accenture workers, and the clustering has to do with certain mentorship networks they have in there. The details there don't matter. What matters is this. We're doing crazy mad science. I am a professional mad scientist. I have done a very good job of tricking venture capitalists into thinking I'm an entrepreneur. I take their money and I run experiments. And then I give them enough money back that they haven't caught on yet. So, but this is an awesome opportunity. What is the opportunity? Let's build a system that can predict the career trajectories of all 425,000 employees. And from that, identify the moments in their lives where we could intervene and make a difference. Not with regard to Accenture, for them. Can we help them live longer, be happier, and yes, be more productive? Are we blunt? I don't really care whether Accenture goes out of business or not. They seem like very nice people. And in fact, the reason I agreed to do this with them, as opposed to many other companies that have approached with similar problems, is, they recognize a powerful, painful future, which is that very possibly within 10 years or so, they might have to lay off 200,000 people. Now, I'm not talking about factory workers. Accenture doesn't have factory workers. I'm not talking about people working in mines or driving cars. I'm talking about people that did everything right. They worked hard. They went to university. They got good grades. They got a great job at a world-class company. And they did everything the parents asked them to do. They're doing everything that their employer asked them to do. And in 10 years, none of that's going to matter, because most of them are doing things like looking at some data on a computer screen, making an assessment of the risk profile of the company they're looking at, and then passing a recommendation on to someone else. Well, it turns out jerks like me can build AIs that do that better than they do. Now, I can't do their whole job. I'm not building an AI to move the paper along. As you're saying, it's not that C-3PO is going to come give you the tap on the shoulder, but rather the core, that you are a very expensive employer. What do you think it costs Accenture to pay 200,000 professional service workers? You know, they're not in the medical space, but broadly speaking, doctors, lawyers, analysts, engineers. Engineers, oh my goodness. If someone promised you knowing how to program was going to mean you'll always have a job, you're in for some big shocks over the next 5 years. I'll come back to that if anyone's interested. So what I liked about Accenture is they said, we don't want to fire them. Part of my job at Amazon would have been all of those factory workers, most of those employees at Amazon are logistics workers. They run their own logistics system. Make them happy to leave after 2 years. We essentially want to rent their back for 2 years. They don't have any place to go inside the company. Let's give them a nice severance package and genuinely figure out how, with all of your fancy tricks, Vivienne, which really, when I talk to a lot of business leaders, they might as well just insert the word Hermione Granger. As deeply as they understand what I do, they just think it's magic, and I will magically make all of these employees want to leave after 2 years. That way they don't get any unions, they don't get lawsuits, everybody's happy, right? No, that's not sustainable. Somebody has to have a job to buy some goddamn stuff so that Amazon can sell it to them. Well, same problem here, except Accenture's response was, we don't want to fire them. Help us figure out how to put value back into those people. Now I could launch into the talk I just gave at MTech about how we can do it. And I think maybe some of the next slides will. But it goes even deeper. This is cool stuff if you're a phenomenal geek like me. Oh, wow, I can do all sorts of fun stuff. So, for example, what is this thing here? It is 400,000 individual units that work together in complicated nonlinear ways and produce this interesting global output. I could be describing a deep neural network, right? Maybe the global output is play this go move, or turn the car to the left, or there's a gorilla in this picture. Although, you know, if you're Google, hey, it turned out it was a black couple, not a gorilla. Whoops. So this is the sort of thing. Well, it turns out we can use the same math, what's called the credit assignment problem, combined with another math out of economics called value-added modeling. And we can figure out, without ever measuring a single individual employee, so we don't look at their localized productivity. We look at the productivity of their team and their division and the company, and we can actually assign the credit for the work they've done. And what we find is because you talk to you know, you're totally different teams, but you hang out a lot and have coffee, and whenever the two of you talk, the productivity of your team goes up. We see that all the time in these models. The vast majority of value creation inside Accenture is unmeasured. It is through collaborative leadership. It's through what's called often emotional labor. It turns out the very sort of things that we promote, being the loudest person in the room, you know, being this sort of outsized deliverer, is in fact a very marginal component of what makes an organization successful. And we have the chance to measure that. Guess what kind of person is most systematically undermeasured, given everything I just said? The value creation inside Accenture of women is huge. And a lot of men also. Don't get me wrong about the distribution of these qualities, but we see a lot of systematic undervaluing. And it's fascinating to be able to do that. So that's what this is. I could now spend the next 5 hours just talking about that project. We could throw up equations. I could slowly put you all to sleep. But it's really fascinating, and it's this incredible ambitious bit of mad science. Can I figure out what the next 20 years of your life is going to be like and help you make choices that will be, in a way that you agree with, will make for a better life? And Accenture reaps the benefits, yeah.
So in the spirit of asking
Please do.
interrupting Bumptious question, so in the academic science world,
Yeah.
there's sometimes this problem called the file drawer problem, right? That if you're doing an experiment and you get a negative result, you put it in the file drawer and you never publish it, and you only publish the positive results,
Yep.
right? And so you might similarly ask sometimes in academia, if you're doing an experiment and you get like a politically incorrect result, people might also be afraid to publish it for the same kind of reason.
Yes.
So I'm actually curious in sort of non-academic science, and people often say this happens because of like the publisher perish bias, but if you're taking VC's money and doing the experiments, or taking Accenture's money and doing the experiments, maybe there's not that bias. So I'm curious about both things, about what happens if you or other people doing this kind of work in a HR organization don't find some magic bullet, what happens? And similarly, what if you found the opposite result? What if you found that only old white men who went to Harvard are the ones who actually contribute the most?
Interesting enough, I literally just read a paper that said exactly that. Which clearly is actually a true statistical relationship that exists in the data. Doesn't turn out to describe any causal reality in the world, but I have an interesting here, which is to say, I get to do what I want anyways. I may well be biased, and in fact, we all are biased. I can't build unbiased AI. There are no unbiased rats in the world. Any complex cognitive system is biased. It is the only way, in fact, for us to make meaningful decisions in the world. And it's interesting. I mean, we could go so deep into this. I still do a couple of lines of purely academic research, particularly in what's called cognitive neuroprosthetics. So can I literally jam things in your brain and make you smarter? If you're curious, the answer, that would be this little section here. The answer would be unambiguously yes in the 1% of you that survived the surgery. So volunteers accepted after the talk. This stuff, people are scared about artificial general intelligence, something no one has invented, and maybe it will come or maybe not. This is coming. And in 20 to 30 years, it will fundamentally change what it means to be human. And that ought to scare people. If nothing else, who? That's a pretty fundamental question. Who will it change? The people whose parents can afford it? Or is it a human right, like a vaccine? We need to think about these things. It shouldn't be creeps like me or Jack Ma or Jeff Bezos deciding this for everyone else. But this is a specific question. So we get lots of non-findings in our work. It's actually one of the reasons we founded a think tank instead of a consultancy is we wanted to be able to do things with the understanding that the whole point here is that we don't know what's going to work. Right? The whole point is to explore into things people don't know. Why am I not doing this in my lab at Berkeley? Because to be honest, I actually find I have an enormous amount of additional flexibility here, and I have ends I never had as an academic scientist. So one of these other data sets, actually none of these other data sets, but I founded a company, I was the chief scientist of a company called Guild. We built a database of 122 million people, and that's where we were looking at some of the factors that are predictive of the most successful employees. And who has data sets of 122 million people? Well, if you trick enough VCs into giving you money, you get to. So what is important is to elucidate some of the things. My wife gets $100,000 from a program that was recently announced. I just talked about this on the other stage. Recently announced a joint project between a bunch of big US tech companies and the White House, $300 million for K-12 CS education. In other words, teach a bunch of kids how to program. And, in some sense, I should keep my mouth shut, right? Accenture's one of those companies. So is Salesforce, who we collaborate with. So is Google, who I've done a lot of past research with. My wife gets money out of this program. keep your stupid mouth shut and say thank you. Well, it turns out, I already told you my feelings about this. Everyone seems to think, right? Programmers, they make all this money. They get to solve these real cool problems, teach everyone how to program. It's a correlate we see in the data. People who know how to program have better jobs. In fact, white guys from conservative backgrounds that know how to program have some of the best jobs. So turns out they're getting the causal relationship completely wrong. The reason they have those jobs isn't because they know how to program. They have those jobs because they're resilient, because they're creative, because they're adaptive. In a minute, I'm going to talk about some of that in more detail. But what's fascinating is you take someone like that and you teach them how to program, they will go do amazing things. Of course, take someone like that and you teach them how to be a journalist, they'll go do amazing things. You teach them design, they'll go do amazing things. So one of the challenges here is knowing whether the statistical relationships you're finding in these data, even the positive ones, much less the non-results, are actually meaningful. And what do you do when you find a non-result? When you find something that would be so easy to just tell people, hey, you know, we didn't find that programming was actually predictive, which in fact is exactly one of the things I found in my research. You've got to tell people. I mean, this is a pernicious problem in science in general, and particularly in policy, which is where I'm moving more and more towards, is advising big organizations, startups, governments on policy issues. You've got to tell them that you found that that didn't work. And if that feels like you didn't deliver on your contract, well, that's why I don't sign contracts. So it's a challenging problem to work through. And if you would like to go into deeper, wonky detail offline, we can certainly do that. So this one's interesting. I don't know how many people know what this is. Yes, it's the Animoji, is the new iPhone 10 stuff. So up above that is a woman named Marnie Stewart Bartlett. She's smiling and frowning, and you can see the system in real time. So that was my undergraduate lab at the Machine Perception Lab at UC San Diego. And it was my introduction to machine learning. Before then, I had no background whatsoever. I really have never taken a class in machine learning. Someone recommended me to work in that lab. I started there. We were doing real-time lie detection for the CIA. So they'd send us these videos without any audio, without any context, and we were supposed to tell them whether the person was lying. Actually, we were supposed to tell them was all the, what's called the facial action code, all the little micro expressions people were given, and then they had a system for doing it, which they trained a bunch of CIA spooks how to do. So our job was to put them out of a business. Sound like the AI problem? So we built this thing that actually they spun off as a startup. And it's called Emotion. It kind of struggled for a few years. Deep neural networks come along. Bam, massive increase in the accuracy, and interestingly, despite the scale, the speed at which these systems work, they're still kind of a business looking for a market. Like, real-time emotion expression as a platform sounds interesting, but what do I do with it? And you know, if you're in that position, that may, and believe me, trust me, as an academic turned entrepreneur, I am intimately familiar with. I have invented cool technology, and I'm smarter than you are. Buy my product. Turns out that doesn't sell anything to anybody. No one wants to buy your broccoli. Nobody does. They only want to buy brownies. And so they had this very clever idea. Do a real-time expression recognition of one of the early Republican presidential debates. So there was, I don't know, 275 people up on stage, and everyone's really wondering, you know, are any of them actually human? I mean, Jeb Bush, like, he's got a brother that we know of, but some of these other guys, they're a little weird. I'm gonna vote for them, but I don't actually know that they're from this planet. So they ran this thing in real time. The bidding war starts the next day between Apple and Facebook. Apple wins. All of the new face technology in the iPhone 10 is from my own, my undergraduate lab. So if you really want to understand innovation, there you go. 20 years of brutally hard research, dozens of dissertations, working on profound problems, like doing real-time lie detection and getting into spy wars. All innovation eventually animates cats online. Everything. Doesn't matter what you come up with. Just wait. When they finally get quantum computing to work, this will be everywhere. In fact, it might either be alive or dead. We don't know. Sorry, that was a really geeky joke. All right, so we've got two more up on the screen, and does anyone have a strong opinion about which one I do first? It's possible I would just run out of time, because I'm kind of going on and on, but the truth is these are amazing stories. This is, I was in New York City, and this young entrepreneur asked if she could grab my time, and I don't even remember what she pitched me. But as she was walking out of the restaurant, she literally says over her shoulder, "You know what, I would give it all up if you could figure out how to treat bipolar disorder." Now, I'm a neuroscientist by training. I'm a theoretical neuroscientist, which if you don't know what that is, just substitute the word lazy for theoretical, and you're good. So we study machine learning to understand the brain. We study the brain to come up with better machine learning. So, this sort of thing. Like, I'm not a neuropsychiatrist. Other than the basics of what bipolar is, which is this very common, one of the most common and costliest mental health disorders around the world. You go from sort of elated, creative, crazed highs where you don't sleep to crashing depressions. 25% of severe sufferers will go on to kill themselves. It is a huge problem all around the world. So she just put this little bug in my ear, and I spent all night reading papers about bipolar. I educated my dumb ass. And the very next day, I was meeting with another group of young entrepreneurs. They had a company. No one comes up with clever names anymore. So they were Emotioned. They were Emosia. So they were doing real-time emotion estimation, or mood, might be technically more accurate, passively off of mobile phones. You just carry your phone around with you, and based on the sensor set in the phone, and a lot of work, they still needed a ton of help, it would estimate your moods, and they were thinking, we could sell ads against it, we could have your radio play the right music based on your mood, they had all these things, and the last thing I wanted to do was get involved in a company that wanted to sell ads. So I talked them, being a scientist, I talked them in, how about market research, right? How do you feel before you get on to, who am I about to fly on? Cathay Pacific. Then I got to spend 20 hours on a plane. How do I feel afterwards? Wouldn't it be nice to have all of that information so you could update your customer experience? So I talked them into it, but that wasn't my ask. My ask was, give me all of your data. I want to build a system to predict manic episodes in bipolar sufferers. And then the third thing happened, the third bit of synergy that actually made this real. In confidence, at the time, one of their employees came up to me and said, I overheard you. I have bipolar. You can use my data. So, by the way, if you're not familiar with bipolar, the drug treatment, famously unpleasant. It only works in half of sufferers anyways. And a great condemnation of neuroscience, we only figured out why last year. At a molecular level, we didn't know why it worked and why it only worked in half of people. Shocking. So I thought, what if I could tell you ahead of time that a manic episode was coming? Importantly, not just you, but someone you love and trust. Famously, once you're in the episode, the world is great. Like, it takes a few days to realize you haven't actually slept in a few days, but hey, you solved everything you ever wanted to solve in your life. Everything's great, and then you get fired, and then you get a divorce, and then you get institutionalized, and it goes downhill from there. So they said yes. I get all this data, and it turns out it wasn't even that hard. We found we could predict a manic episode 3 to 4 weeks before what we call the subjective onset, before the person themselves would have been aware of it. Our goal, as we say, is to do it faster than your best friend could have noticed. And in fact, we can do it faster than that. and you don't do anything. You just carry your phone around with you. The reason we're showing a heat map here, it's actually very high dimensional, lots of different sensor sets, but actually that motion data was one of the most predictable. So it's the GPS, gyroscope, accelerometer. When we see those motion patterns change within a few hours, we have a strong prediction of an oncoming manic episode weeks from now. It's fascinating. It's really cool. Similar stuff is being done with Parkinson's at Google. So just based on the sensor set, they can actually detect this very early diagnosable predictor of Parkinson's based on subtle changes in your gait. You couldn't feel it. No one can see it when you're walking, but they can see it in their motion data. They also know what room in your house is the bathroom, so think hard about where you take your phone. Yes, I'm sure so does Facebook, so does Baidu, so does Tencent, everybody. So this is cool, and this needed to happen, right? We just gave the technology away. In fact, I don't think anything up here is a business. Nope, everything here is just give it away. So this, the final one of these initial stories is, was actually started at my first startup. So we were an ed tech company, and I needed to learn what it meant to be an entrepreneur. So my company was called Ogniscient. First lesson, title your company something people can pronounce. There was a lot of other things I learned. As an ed tech company, it was a good education for me. So we needed some way to prove, what were we trying to do? We were trying to end high-stakes testing. What if we could put a microphone in the classroom with kids, or listen to a chat discussion between college students, and without ever looking at their homework or their essays or their exams, predict the grade they got in the course? I'm not trying to build an automatic grading system. In fact, my whole point, which we were able to publish a number of papers showing, was we knew at week 1 what grade they would get, with no experts involved, without looking at the homework, just listening to them talk about the course material. So if I can tell you at week 3, these 5 students will fail this specific question on the final exam, why give them the final exam? In fact, why not fix the fact that you know they will fail that question? So we were starting to explore how to pair this with directed recommendations about the kind of interventions that would change that specific student's understanding. So this is our big ambition. First startup. I may have a lot of fancy, smancy degrees, but it turns out when you're a first-time entrepreneur, VCs don't care what fancy degrees you have. It turns out they do care whether you have breasts, but, and it doesn't help you, sorry. They needed something very tangible. So I built what would you do? If you had an amazing technology, what you feel is provable, but is not visceral, this is over the course of weeks, of times, of people talking, how could you build something that could convey to them the value? Well, if you have an amazing technology and you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, you build a incredibly sleazy game called Sexy Face. You play this game, we show you a bunch of faces, you pick the ones you think are sexy. And pretty soon, our system figures it out. Unless you have a foot fetish. It was all about faces. So if you got a foot thing, we needed to know that ahead of time. And if you got a foot thing, come talk to me. So I'm married, sorry. I'm also like 57,000 years old. So we built this system, and we would play it out. And here was our pitch. For free, we'll find everyone on Facebook that you think is sexy. And for $5, we'll find everyone who thinks you're sexy. So I'm not a completely awful person. That's what's called a Trojan. As soon as you play the one round of the game, and it really would work, then it confesses, actually, this is just a mind-reading game. Play it once through, and then come up with anything. Southeast Asian, mutton chops, and a sense of ennui. As long as you were genuinely consistent about how you made your judgments, the damn thing would figure it out. I mean, it doesn't figure it out in the sense that it truly understands. I hope no one's confused. AlphaGo Zero doesn't understand anything about Go. It will keep playing Go as the building it's in burns down. If you change one rule about Go, it will lose every single game. But within the scope of what it experienced in the past, it is phenomenally powerful. So within the scope of people playing the game, we could learn even these abstract qualities like competence. So even that turns out to be a Trojan. Why did we build this thing? Why did we come up with the game, kind of importantly? Because it didn't just learn about faces. It was learning about how people perceive faces. Why? Because right now, actually, to be honest, 10 years ago, but I'm willing to bet, if anything, the numbers have gone up, there are 1 million orphans in refugee camps around the world. They're too little to know what village they're from. They're too little to know what their last name is or who their uncle is. So if you're living in Damascus and you haven't heard from your sister's family in months and you're fearing the worst, and you go to a refugee camp in Jordan, they give you a book with 1 million photographs in it. And you might be able to narrow that down by only looking in Syria, but hate to break it to you, that doesn't narrow it down that much right now. And, you know, day 3, when her picture goes past, I hope you didn't blink. So we built this system. It turns out it takes about 3 minutes to run. It's kind of similar. We show you an array of photos out of it, a little different. You pick the ones that look a little bit more like your niece. Within about 3 to 5 minutes, if she's in a camp anywhere in the world, you found her. So it's part of a program called Refugees United. I'm very proud of that particular piece of work, but it also gives you a sense, this is what AI can be. AI doesn't have to be about selling ads or supply chain optimization. I'm not poo-pooing that. If you want to build a great company, that is hard enough. Don't be an idiot. Don't do what I do. Just focus on building your company. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you really want to make a difference in the world, then that's why you're doing what you do. No one paid us to do any of these things. And in some of them, once we developed it, we gave it away. 6 years ago, it was a Sunday, my son threw up. We thought he had the flu. And I didn't think anything of it. We checked in with his doctor. He said, don't worry about it, lots of fluids, that classic story. So the next day, he was still really sick, and then he seemed to get a little better. But by Wednesday, he was having trouble standing up. He'd lost 15 pounds. Sorry, work with the pounds. I'm not going to do the conversion in my head. And off of a 40-pound frame. So, we're running into the U.S. Thanksgiving holiday, 4-day weekend. We weren't waiting any longer. At the end of the day, we call up the doctor and we say, listen, this is getting really bad. He hasn't really eaten anything in 2 days. And in fact, there's no way he should have lost this amount of weight in 4 days. There's something seriously wrong. We go into the doctor. They don't even need to run any tests. Turns out at this point, you can smell it on him. Type 1 diabetes. So neither of us have any family history, so totally by surprise to us. Type 1 is an autoimmune disease. Your immune system, you probably get a cold. It probably happened maybe 6 months before. It may not even be a clinical, which is to say that you may not have even noticed it. And it just so happened that virus expressed a protein very similar to a protein being expressed by the cells in your pancreas that make insulin. So once they wipe out the virus, they say, let's go kill all those. And they do. It happens a little slowly at first, but then they get really good at it. And all of the food that you eat, no matter how much, all the sugar just starts accumulating in your bloodstream. Because without insulin, it can't get inside your cells. And you literally starve to death with a stomach full of food and a body full of sugar. And we'll add into the nuance, suddenly out of nowhere, a kid who was perfectly potty trained was wetting the bed 3 times a night. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but it turns out it's a very common symptom. It's the only way to get rid of all that extra sugar. If you're a little kid, what else are you going to do? I'd feel terrible. I used to get mad. I would shout at him. I was so mean. He was literally trying to stay alive. So this was a hard thing to hear. And like many families, our discovery of this meant we spent 4 days at the Oakland Children's Hospital Pediatric Care Unit, intensive care, 4 days. So one thing I can say about that is we left as a family. There were 4 other families there with us for the same reason, and one of them did not. And then, of course, there's all sorts of other little kids that were never going to leave. So a lot of perspective on how hard it was for our family. But it turns out that wasn't the thing that I truly found shocking about the whole experience. What was shocking was a month later. So my wife and I are both scientists. So we started collecting data, everything we could get, where everything he ate to the gram, including fat levels, carb levels, protein levels. Did he have the sniffles? When did it happen? What was all of his blood glucose readings? How active? We start putting a basis band, basically a smartwatch, on him. We're tracking heart rate, galvanic skin response, sweat response, basically. And we have all of these numbers we're generating. We crashed Google Docs several times. Turns out it's a little better now. But so we had all this data, and we're going in for our first outpatient visit with his new endocrinologist. And someone who I like, and it's still a doctor, and I still respect her. And so first thing we do is we email them all of our data. And we don't really get any responses. I think, God, they want paper copies. So we print out, it was like an inch thick of spreadsheet data, all of this stuff we collected about our son, and we bring it in thinking they're gonna love us. Yeah, well, I am in the future now with all of you, so I understand they did not love us. In fact, one of the nurses there, they were angry with us. They were angry with us for wasting their time. What am I supposed to do with all of this data? Little aside, if in the course of your job you ever say, what am I supposed to do with this data? That job is not long for this world, at least not the way you're doing it. Work through that in your head. So, in my wild arrogance, I think to myself, I make models of the brain. Are you telling me diabetes is more complex than the brain? She gave us a photocopied sheet of paper, 5 days, 3 boxes, right? Pick 15 arbitrary blood glucose readings, write them on the sheet of paper. She eyeballed it for like 5 minutes with the head nurse, and they said, here's what we'll do for the next 6 months. I said, you gotta be fucking kidding me. It's crazy. I mean, and we can go into all sorts of technical details about what we know about diabetes and how to treat it and all sorts of things, and we know, how many cases? I'm gonna tell a joke. So, 2 mathematicians get blasted at some dive bar, and they stumble out in the wee hours of the morning and wander down this dark alleyway. About halfway through, the first one fumbles the keys, drops them on the ground, but continues to stumble down towards the end of the alley. And the second one's confused, what? And he follows after him. Finally, they reach the end, and there's a street light, and the first mathematician drops to his knees and starts feeling around. And the second one says, what are you doing? You dropped the keys back in the alleyway. And the first one says, well, at least here I can see what I'm doing. It's supposed to be a joke about nonlinear and linear mathematics. If you didn't get it, then you're probably a good person. But it turns out, man, that describes a lot of things. The things we do to treat diabetes or to hire people, or so many of the things that are on this screen, we know don't work. You know what's not predictive of your ability on the job? A job interview. And I'm not saying this like flippantly. I mean well-researched. And the people giving you those interviews, maybe not the recruiters themselves, but their bosses, they know they're not predictive. You ask them why they run it, and I've had companies in this space, so I know them intimately well, and their answer is, we know it's not predictive, but what else are we supposed to do? We don't know. So they do it just to have done something. Isn't that how many man-hours worth of work goes into a behavior that we know produces no positive effect whatsoever? Well, we see that amply in diabetes. So I thought, fuck this. I hacked all of my son's equipment. Sorry, I could be way out of line for a for a Singapore audience. Forgive me, dirty mind. And I haven't heard a dirty joke yet, so you've got that in your future. So we hacked all of his diabetes equipment, broke, as it turns out, several US federal laws, and I took all the data that was going to some black box server of those companies, and I guarantee you, in fact, I know this because I've actually now worked with those companies, they were doing nothing with it. I sent it to my server, and then I took a model about, it doesn't matter that much, but the predictive coding in the retina, and I repurposed it to predict an hour into the future whether my son's blood glucose levels will go high or low. You know what the gold standard is today? You get something called a continuous glucose monitor. It tells you whether it was high or low 20 minutes ago. And in fact, we saw correlations that ranged days into the future, which, if you talk to an endocrinologist, they'll say, no, that's not biologically possible. We know the time course of this. Well, blood glucose isn't blood glucose. Blood glucose is a little boy. And it turns out that little boy, when he's low one morning, the next day he eats more at night. Has nothing to do with, well, I mean, it does, of course, involve the closed loop system of his digestive system, but it's a kid who was dying and now is alive. And partly because his crazy mom hacked all of his medical devices and built something it turns out no one has ever built before. So what did we do with this? We used it on my son because it turns out it's actually literally against the law for me to even give the code away to anybody. It would be giving medical advice, and I'm the fake kind of doctor, twice over. But so we couldn't do it. And so instead what it is, I gave some talks about it, so it was out there. Parents knew that this could be done, and then I got on the phone with engineers at any company that wanted to know how I built it. And a lot of people I meet think, why didn't you patent it? You could have patented it and licensed it to Medtronic or Eli Lilly or anybody. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. When I look at that, it actually seems crystal clear to me. I mean, I'm smart enough to understand that this sounds very self-aggrandizing and it sounds kind of ludicrous. But this is how I thought about it. If I license it, it will go to one company, fewer people will be helped, and more people will die. If I give it away, and also, there's no guarantee they will ever release anything. Once they license the patent, they can just sit on it. If their main competitor knows how to build the exact same thing, the only way to keep it off the market is collusion, and the parents know that it exists. So here's one of the cool things that AI has done. So one of the companies I visited and shared some of this with is Eli Lilly, one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And I met a young man there who's taking the predictive models, extending it into a deep neural network. I wasn't required for the original work. Building it into what's called an artificial pancreas, which is really just a closed-loop insulin pump. It's like a thermostat. It works better than the real thing. It's not on the market yet, but in fact, it comes with some interesting ethical implications, right? If you have a family history of type 2 diabetes, the other famous kind, do you get a prophylactic artificial pancreas? Do we allow people with an artificial pancreas to compete in the Olympics? It's interesting questions come out of some of this stuff. But this is what you can do. It's the kind of the cool things. Sometimes these projects literally come crashing into my life. So when my son is having a hard night, and it happens, to make life all the more fun for him, he was just diagnosed with autism. And he has hard nights, and sometimes when he needs a little extra something, I let him know that as hard as this is for him and for all of us, that because this happened to our family, literally millions of people will be alive. And he was at the center of that. And it's very possible. There are actually a lot of other fascinating technologies in this space, some of which might genuinely be a cure. It's been 30 years of cure promises in diabetes, as with most of these chronic illnesses, but we might actually be close, both because of the artificial pancreas work, as well as a whole bunch of different genetic engineering and some other cool technologies that are out there. It's a fascinating space. My metric is very simple. How many lives have I made better? I'm thrilled if I can get rich along the way, but turns out I never saw a business plan I couldn't make worse. Okay, so here's a quick summary thing. I wasn't going to focus on this for this talk, but it's one takeaway. A lot of people want to get a sense of what artificial intelligence is at a sort of a human level, not the mathematics of it, not the kind of wonky technical details, but what does it mean? So this is what I suggest. It's kind of a riff on an idea from Andrew Ng, the Stanford AI head, founder of Coursera, former chief scientist at Baidu. He and I collaborated on some papers in almost literally a different life. And he said, what was that? Oh, he is? I actually had no idea. See, this is terrible. I just assumed he was from like Hong Kong or something. I have no sense of accents. And nobody understands my accent either. I'm born and raised in California, and people meet me, and then they say, so where are you from? I'm like, what the fuck? I realize I look like a Valkyrie, but I'm not from Norway. So he said, if you want to understand, think of any like 1 second judgment that a human being could make. Are you happy? Are you a specific person? But we can actually really generalize that. He has tended to work in some very targeted domains. I work across a lot of very broad domains. A human being cannot read a resume in a second. It takes, in fact, several minutes for someone to read a resume, but that's also a perfect example. One of my companies called Guild, we built this database of 122 million people, and we analyzed not just resumes, we collected, without your permission, you probably, well, no, most of you are too young. And fuck you for that, too. It was very offensive to me when I realized my students didn't get my Gilligan's Island jokes anymore. And then when they didn't get my Seinfeld jokes anymore, and then we're starting to move into this century, there really is nothing. When one of my employees once walked up to me and said, when I was little and on Facebook, I said, fuck you too. That is not acceptable. Little and on Facebook. So I'm just trying to describe like 12 words here, and it's taking me half an hour. I blame you. So AI is any brief human judgment. And brief is really context-defined. Turns out it takes human beings a bit to read, despite having invented it, so that's a little slow. Our system could run through, 100 million profiles overnight. Human beings can't do that. In fact, recruiters are really well studied. They give you 5 seconds, and they look at 3 things: your name, your school, and your last job. And if that does not fit in pattern, they don't even tell you no. You just go into the shredder. So needless to say, by the way, none of those 3 things are meaningfully predictive. We can talk about details if you want to. But so that's a perfect example of something that is the bread and butter of work like mine. And this is diverse. Is there a gorilla in this photo? Should we turn the car to the left? Is this person happy or sad? Is this kid one of the photos that we're looking for? In many of these contexts, you might well be either spending a large amount of money to hire a human being to do that specific judgment, and that's probably, we put a lot of paperwork around it, we spend a lot of time with them going to corporate retreats, but pretty much that's 80% of their job. So if you can do that, you get 80% of their job at essentially none of the cost. So, to finish the sentence, any brief expert judgment, faster, cheaper, and in many contexts, better than a human being can make it. So famously, for example, AI systems are surpassing dermatologists in doing cancer diagnoses. And there are many, many contexts where that sort of thing is true. Yeah? So it's necessary. Why is it necessary for it to be brief? So it turns out, I was saying earlier, we have not invented what's called artificial general intelligence. No one in the world has invented intelligence like ours, that thinks about the world in the way we do. So a good way to understand the brief is a recent paper just published by Facebook on the failure of chatbots. chatbots are usually pretty obviously bots. The only times where they succeed is kind of when the person they're talking to is an idiot. And you're like, oh yeah, this is definitely a human being. And you're like, that chatbot said it was a firefighter from Mars. Are you really paying attention to what's going on? So there are a couple of cases where AIs can do a phenomenal job of spoofing human-like behavior, but they're very brief. So why do chatbots fail? Because they're holding an extended conversation with you. And it turns out there's no real flow-through in their conversation. In the case of the paper from the Facebook group, they're looking at how do we build sort of like a profile. You basically, it's like, okay, AI, ready? Scene. You are a firefighter from Mars, and you really like Monty Python, and you desperately need to go to the bathroom. Chat. And the idea is they're somehow going to carry this through the conversation. But that isn't really the problem. So why is it right now, in some sense, what we have figured out with machine learning is what some people call mid-level perception. But even then, it's not exactly right. What AI does is very different than what we do. It is a massive statistical engine that can take an enormous amount of data and distill it down to a specific set of categorical patterns or action recommendations. And those sorts of things, it does phenomenally well. But what it doesn't do well is anything it's never seen before. So right now, the sweet spot are these relatively brief, context-defined brief judgments. But how you connect together, given this person's resume, ask it a question. Do you think that they would like the show Friends? I mean, well, did I train it to make that specific prediction? Did I have data that would allow it to do it? It makes these very sort of punctate actions in the world. We may well be pushing farther beyond that, but I think we need some significant new discoveries to be able to do that well. But still, this is already huge. This is an enormous amount of human value creation around the world. I know we're afraid of what happens when we put all those taxi drivers and lorry drivers out of work. What happens if we don't need ag workers anymore? If we don't need natural resources workers? 3 largest job verticals in the world, and jerks like me are building AI systems to obviate the need. One might argue that human beings shouldn't be going down in mines. They shouldn't be bent over in fields 12 hours a day. I would argue that that would be a human good. There is a corollary. What do we do with all those people? That is a recipe for social disaster. But in fact, what I'm worried about is what happens not to the lorry drivers and the factory workers. What happens to the lawyers and the doctors that are about to get blindsided by this, who thought they did everything right? They did all the right things. And they think, but my job is so complex. I do all this stuff. I move all this paper around. Well, the reason we pay you a lot of money is to make this. I've watched, my dad was an gastroenterologist. I watched him scope someone once. I'm sure they were thrilled that there was a little kid in the room. And he said, see that little duct there? And I said, no. The scope goes through the duct. And he says, oh, look there. I grabbed that little growth. It all looks like a horror movie to me. I don't know what you see, but I don't see anything. But he was able to make this very punctate expert judgment. That was the value. If that judgment could have been made by me via an AI, you could have paid me $10 an hour as a summer job to do it. And that is the future of work. If instead of hiring fancy-smancy doctors and giving them fancy technologies to become super doctors, I can instead hire 3 lab techs for less money, see 3 times as many patients, and let's say they're 80% as good in their diagnoses. Hell, in a straight productivity, if you're the CFO of a health maintenance company, you're going to take that. You'll take that bet. In fact, I know you're taking that bet because that's what the last 30 years of global labor markets has been doing. Now, we can choose to use AI for another purpose. we can choose to use it to make people better. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This is seeming very similar to the last time. I do talk about other things, a lot of other things. So this was kind of fun. I mentioned this company, Guild, and I told you what we did. We built this huge database, and we predicted who our customers ought to hire. Our tagline was, we take bias out of the hiring process. It was very important to the two co-founders that we not become a diversity company. So this was bias broadly defined. Did you need to go to Harvard to get this job? Do you need 5 years of work history at Amazon to be employable? Yeah, you know, we're going to take out the gender bias and the racial bias, but you know, the heart of our business, the truth is that our customers, Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Citibank and all these big companies, they just wanted to find great software developers. And the problem was, if you're Google, you already know all the great software developers that have a piece of paper that says that they're great. So how do you find everybody else? So our research found that for every highly credentialed person who genuinely wrote superlative code, there were 10 to 100 times as many people that didn't have the same credentials and were just as qualified. And one of them's up on the screen. So this guy's name is Jade Dominguez, grew up in LA. He's actually a pretty good secondary school student, but no one in his family had ever gone to university, and he didn't go. But he was a very entrepreneurial guy, so he started selling t-shirts on the street. Like, he'd do these little designer t-shirts and sell them on the street in LA. And after a little while, he's frustrated. He's feeling, I could sell more t-shirts if I had a website. So, I don't know when this is exactly, early 2000s. So he starts up like a push-button website, you know, very standard sort of thing. And he sells some more t-shirts, but it's not good enough. So he teaches himself how to program. Ruby, if you're curious. And he designs his own website, and he sells more t-shirts, but now he doesn't care about the t-shirts at all. He's frustrated because Ruby isn't good enough. Now, Ruby, if you're not aware, is what's called an open source language. Nominally, we all contribute to building it. In reality, all open source languages are really highly regulated. Companies don't want crackpots writing the code that runs their company, their websites, and Ruby, for example, runs a lot of global websites. So, nonetheless, this high school kid named Dominguez in LA trying to sell t-shirts starts doing pull requests, essentially asking for his code to be accepted and integrated, and they're getting accepted. And so many of the biggest websites around the world are running his code, and he's thinking, why the hell am I selling t-shirts in LA? I should go get an engineering job in Silicon Valley. So for a year, he sends resumes up to the valley. I already told you what happened. They gave him 5 seconds. Dominguez, nothing, nothing. No school, no job. And if you're not familiar, being named Dominguez does not help you get a job in the United States. So he's getting frustrated. And this could be a story that very much in the vein of, hey, what this problem really needs is a good white person. No, that really isn't the story here at all. He gets a call from a startup. It was us. And in that call, we said, hey, our algorithm tells us you're the second best Ruby developer in all of Los Angeles. Can we fly you up for a job interview? And he came up. He became our lead front-end engineer. It was a bit of a risk because he'd never worked with anyone before. But frankly, we couldn't hire anyone we couldn't compete with Google and Facebook. What are you going to do? We have to take risks. And he happened to be one of the safest bets we could take. That's what our algorithm said. We ate our own dog food. He and I, about 6 months later, were the cover story of the New York Times. The founders were pissed that they were on page 3. But our chief scientist is like, everyone, and admittedly, everyone thought I founded the company as a result, but really, they were assholes. So you reap what you sow. So he was amazing. In fact, 2 years later, he went on and founded his own company. That's right. We didn't do him a favor. He did us a favor. We were just smart enough to get out of our own heads. I already said, everybody's biased. I'm biased. My system that does hiring is biased, but what I will tell you, it is vastly less biased than the human beings that were looking at his resume. We analyzed 55,000 data points to make our decisions, and that was after discovering several 100,000 other ones. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. Yeah?
Yeah, so I think this brings me to the point of education, right? So this guy was, he doesn't have much of an education background, and you still managed to find him. So putting things in perspective, like, what is the future of education? Like, if I'm a kid who is in secondary school, I know all this AI is gonna take over. I mean, last time when I was a kid, maybe I wanna go to Harvard, maybe I wanna become doctor and lawyer. So what is in it for me anyway? Because what am I looking at in the future? Thanks.
So we built this model, and we looked at what was actually predictive. What are our null results? Well, admittedly, our null results were pretty interesting, and people really wanted to hear them. So what's not predictive? Your grades, your standardized test scores, the university you went to. Bachelor of Computer Science from Stanford, which our own system said, after analyzing all of this code and everything, was the best computer science school in the world. Very small, though positive, predictor. As I said once in a tweet, CMU was better than Berkeley, and MIT was better than CMU, and Caltech was better than MIT, go California. And Stanford was better than all the rest, and they were all trivial compared to motivation. If I knew someone was motivated, then that's who I should hire. Now, of course, there's a good reason people are at Stanford. They tend to be highly endogenously motivated. But it turns out that's the causal factor that got them there. It got them their good grades. It now makes them the person you want to hire. The Stanford is just the signaling. And I'm not saying it has no value at all, but it clearly is a signaling factor. So I just went through all the things that aren't predictive. Actually, you want to know the shock? Something we did find? The bottom 2/3 of universities in our global analysis were negative predictors. Now, that's worth really reflecting on and thinking about. And I have a story, but I'm not going to tell it right now. So what else is actually not predictive? What does I don't know if any of you are in the HR industry, what do all job searches from the hirer standpoint start with? It starts with typing SAP into LinkedIn, or Java, or sales. You start with a skills search, right? I got a job spec, from which I, as the recruiter, don't understand, especially if it's a technical job. So I just literally take the words out of the job spec, I drop it into a search engine, it gives me a bunch of names, and I spam all of them, and I hope I get like a 1% hit rate, and then I refer all of them to the hiring manager, which then runs the previously affirmed, completely unpredictive interviews. So, so it turns out skills are not predictive. Now, clearly, you need to know how to do something to do the job. But it turns out it's what you might call a secondary effect. So let me put it this way, and then we can get into the positive side. A craftsman and their tools. So tools, in my metaphor, are all the skills and the knowledges. In fact, there are a lot of the new emerging technologies, the AI. Those are the tools. So there's two things about tools. One, they are not meaningfully predictive about positive life outcomes. I'll define what I mean by that in a moment. Two, there are no tools that are robot-proof. None. So nonetheless, tools are how we hire people. Tools are how we run our education system. Kind of partially like the mathematician joke. Tools, we get it. It's actually about the craftsman. But I don't know how to measure the craftsman. I don't know how to have, an SAT, a standard assessment of your resilience or of your working memory span. I don't know how to do that. So we're going to pretend like we don't know that it's meaningful. And instead, we're going to assess whether you know how to factorize a polynomial. And if you don't happen to know exactly how to do that, the same time as all of your peers, I'm going to give you a bad grade, and then it's going to follow you for the rest of your life. So, interesting little interlude here. I was a very unhappy kid. And everyone understood that I was smart, but no one knew how to get me to do anything. And so I really struggled for a while. And by the time I reached secondary school, high school in the US, I was borderline flunking out. I'd sleep through my classes and not really pay attention to anything. And I, purely based on standardized test scores, I got into a lot of universities and then immediately flunked out. And then I was homeless for several years. So it's not your typical story of the road to entrepreneurial success, but it's worth sharing. Any of you feel like, oh, God, my life is over. I didn't get a perfect score in a class. I think I've got you beat. You can actually pronounce my college transcript. So it's all F's. And then I was homeless for about 10 years. Several years. It's a complicated story. I got my life back together. And it took time. I mean, when you dig a deep hole, you got to climb back out of it. It took a long time. And I saved up enough money to go back to school. It's because you got to, I don't know how it is here, but you got to pay for it in the States. And I finished my entire undergraduate degree in a single year and got perfect grades in every class. Why did that happen? I had a purpose. I had a reason for being there. I had a reason because I needed a reason to be alive. Because sometime in 1995, I couldn't tell you when, I had a gun, and I spent the entire night figuring out why not to kill myself. And my reason was, live a life that makes other people's lives better. And that may sound very la-di-da to you. I needed a way to make decisions in my life because every other way had failed me. And that was it. Now that has morphed, that purpose has changed. Nowadays, I say, I'm here to build better people. And I intentionally kind of actually make my purpose sound a little scary because I don't want people to just say, well, she's very smart, go let her do what she wants to do. No, what I do is scary. Everyone should be scared. I want to stick things in people's brains. That should be scary. I want to decide who gets jobs. I actually don't want to, but that's a reasonable interpretation of what some of my companies have done. I want to decide how all kids around the world get educated. I shouldn't decide that. We should decide that. I'm happy to build it. I'm happy to invent it. I'm happy to explore what's possible so I can go back and say, this can be done. Turns out, you can build an AI that can predict whether a kid with diabetes will have an attack, hours before it happens. No one thought that you could, but turns out you can. So, I don't say this because I'm trying to give like a self-help talk here. But I am saying this because there's a reason why I do what I do. All these things I've talked about so far, and I hope you didn't realize, you may not have, we've got another 5 hours. So I think I hear some silent weeping in the background. Just wait. So I have barely scratched the surface of all the incredibly cool projects I get to work on, and none of them should have happened. None of them. If you've been laying odds when I was 25, your best bet is dead by 30. And yet, at 30, my life changed. And everything reversed. And suddenly, here I am. And emotionally, I still own all of that failure. But intellectually, given the work I do, I look at this trajectory, this person who did all these things, literally millions of people are alive because of the things she invented. What happened? How did this person slip through the system? And I mean, let's be blunt, white, California, my dad was a doctor, my mom was a teacher. We weren't enormously wealthy, but we were well off in an amazing place. I grew up in a little valley. John Steinbeck wrote a book about it called The Pastures of Heaven. And I'll add a little twist here. Male, if you didn't know, that was part of the issue. I had every advantage, and I squandered all of it. And what about people that didn't have all those advantages, but they could be doing exactly what I'm doing? They could be influencing the world in all the ways you are or imagining you're going to, but we thought, I got mine, and I don't know anybody else anything. That is fucked up. It's fucked up that that person is the President of the United States. So this is why I do what I do, and I dive deep into these sorts of questions. So we probably are oh, really? Is that the whole thing? Or are you just giving up on me and turning the whole thing off? Okay, so you had a question about what's actually predictive, and I really should stop here, but I will answer this question. If I had my vision of what education should be, oh, this is awful and unintelligible, so let's jump ahead. Human capital is a toxic asset. It's a positive statement about the world. This guy is an amazing skateboarder. That's what you needed to know about the talk. Actually, this is a TED Talk. It was originally titled The Fanatic, and they thought that was too controversial. So if you want to search for it online, search for the very poetic, The Paradox of Incentive Insensitivity. But it's about motivation. It's about that endogenous motivation. Turns out it's a huge predictor of positive life outcomes, which I will take a moment to define. How about we just shotgun it? What sorts of things lead to greater wealth, greater income, greater social connectedness, increased walking speed at age 65, greater subjective measures of happiness, greater objective measures of happiness, and 8 different biomarkers relating to health outcomes, including ones you have a congenital disposition for? Well, you want to know the things about you that make all of those better? It's this stuff. Nothing you learn in school. It's not how to factorize a polynomial, which I'm basically an applied mathematician. I think everyone should know how to factorize a polynomial, but I hate to break it to you, that is not what is What are you going to do with that talent? That's a tool. It's about the craftsman. So general cognitive ability, and numeracy is here. It doesn't matter that you understand math. General cognitive ability really can only be changed age 5 through 8, but if you're ever planning on having kids, that's it. This is a line from my TED Talk. Sorry, Tiger Moms, but it's actually you as a role model, not as dictator, that predicts the life outcomes of your kids. They become the person you are. You want to be a better parent? Be a better person. That's it. Very easy. That was such a useful piece of advice for you. I'm sure you all have to actualize it right now. So general cognitive ability, social skills, emotional intelligence, creativity. I would actually replace the top line with what we call metacognition. So this is things like self-assessment, strategic thinking. This is it. You don't see programming up here. You don't see, and here's a fascinating one, social skills. Equally predictive for software developers and salespeople. Turns out many fewer software developers have great social skills, as anyone who's ever worked with them will tell you, but when they have them, they are just as predictive. That may shock James Damore, former Google employee, but I hate to break it to you, understanding other people helps you write better code. Want to know one of the cool things we did to analyze that we found was actually predictive of better code? Commenting in the code. You communicate to other people well why you did what you did and what it actually all means. Turns out great writing skills isn't just about whether you can structure your function well. Emotional intelligence. I've done a lot of research in that space. In fact, one of the cool things is it's not just the growth mindset of the kid. You want to build an effective education system, it's the growth mindset of the parent. Do you truly believe your child can change? If you don't, there's very little anyone else can help you with. If you do, now that opens up all sorts of possibilities. So I'm not going to go through all these in detail. In fact, I'm going to stop soon because I think they hate me now. But this is it. If I built my education system, it would be about the craftsman. It would be about building these, and you may think, yeah, well, who wouldn't if they could? So why are they on this list? They're on this list because they are measurable. Everything on here is definable as a construct in the psychological literature or the neuroscience literature. 2, because they are highly predictive and in some cases provably causally related to positive life outcomes. For example, working memory span is provably causally related, so are a number of others. And 3, while many of these have meaningful genetic components or other aspects that really make them beyond our ability to change, everything is on here because there's a copious scientific literature demonstrating that you can intervene on them and change them in a person. And in fact, other than the general cognitive, which is largely just changeable in little kids, the other 4 are changeable in all of you. And the challenge in building such an education system is I can't give you a class on resilience, right? There isn't a workbook that I can give you. You want to develop resilience? You need to fall on your face. You need to fail and still come out positive on the other side. So when we engineer, there's actually a great, I'm so sorry, but there's a great set of papers that just came out, and it should be relevant to all of you. What is sort of training can we give entrepreneurs that would change their likelihood of success? So first group gets no training. That's our control group. You'd be shocked how much research doesn't have a control group. I'm always shocked. Next group, they're going to get financial training. So we're going to teach you all about finance. We're going to teach you how to run your books, read a P&L, everything you need to know. Next group gets business training, right? This is the whole point. Well, that's why we all go get MBAs, right? Or well, some of us. I try not to be offended that most of my academic talks now are business schools. So the other 2 trainings are resilience and mindset. So it turns out neither the business nor the financial training showed a meaningful statistical difference from the baseline. Didn't change anything about the success of the entrepreneurs that they were tracking. Whereas both resilience and mindset training had, in some cases, profound impacts. Like 60% more of the companies were still in business 2 years later. And that was the resiliency training. Like amazing effects. You rarely see effects this big. And the cool thing, these were applied. These are real entrepreneurs starting real businesses, and they got these various trainings. So, this is it. Another thing is, this is just as predictive in 3-year-olds as it is in global CEOs. So build an education system that drives this because you can. And this is a perfect example of the kind of crazy nonsense I dive headfirst into because it needs to happen. We know we're doing the wrong thing. We know it. And yet we say, at least here I can see what I'm doing.
Don't mean to distract, but I noticed that there's no use of the word imagination.
It turns out, there are some interesting things. There is construct imagination. Turns out we could go so deep here, and I need to shut up because they're really starting to give me the eye. But imagination is incredibly fascinating. People with higher imagination have all sorts of both positive and negative traits. So there's a deep discussion to have there. Really, what you're seeing, I think there's like 35 of them up on this screen. We actually track 50 right now, and we just kind of stopped because we got a little tired. There are probably a lot more to look at. But if you look at them, for example, as grit and motivation and perseverance and resilience, they are independently defined in the research literature, but they're surely not truly independent of one another. We wanted to sit back and really analyze this 50. We get to do it across literally thousands and thousands of people now. No one else gets to do this. And really see what are, in fact, the core intrinsic dimensions of variability across people. But it's perfect. I have never really figured out human beings. You are all very strange to me. I understand that there's this thing called love and compassion. I understand that my wife expresses it towards me, and as a good, AI stand-in, I can simulate it back towards her. So it's not that we don't have love and compassion in here, and in fact, some things, there's stuff that's on here like conscientiousness and openness that are, again, well-defined in the literature and highly predictive of outcomes. I think it's worth thinking about things like love and compassion. What it amounts to is no one has gone out, defined it well as a construct so that via repeated measures we get the same scores on people, and then demonstrated that it has these causal relationships that we're really focusing on. Does that mean it doesn't? Not at all. Does it mean we can't develop things for it? Sure, we'll make it numbers 51 and 52 on the list once I get enough time. But I think some of these things are really open. I'm not saying that this is it. I'm just saying, compared to the things we're already doing, this is where we should be starting. And you don't have to start with 50. You can start with, focus on 3 of them and see if you can drive those into your students or into your employees. Yeah?
Okay, so having this mind map or thing, what's your prediction on when the actual education systems of governments will move towards this, and possibly with the help of AI? Is there a way they can?
So that's a pretty big problem and a big question. As I said on the stage at MTech, it takes a good 20 to 30 years to build a human being. But it takes a jerk like me 2 years to build a new AI. So in other words, why did I call human capital a toxic asset in the slide I didn't dwell on? That's kind of it. Or we could call it an inconvenient truth. You know, the decisions we made about how to educate our kids right now are not going to be realized for another 30 years. So there's 2 profound problems. One is, what do we do for the kids? And it's all takers for me. Clearly, the US federal government is not a good audience for this right now, but I get to work with the World Bank and the World Economic Forum and LEGO and UNESCO. Anyone and everyone that's open to doing something different, I want to talk to them. At the same time, we need to think about what do we do with people right now? You know, coming out of secondary school, coming out of university, in the job market already. I'm telling you I can change adults, but it is harder. And that actually I think is a much more immediate, because we need to get to that point. And you know, I want to make certain that there's still some coherence to our society over 20 years from now, so that those kids have something to go to. So 2 separate questions. How do we do it right now? Everywhere, that's the work I'm doing internally with a lot of big companies. And then how do we make fundamental change in education? Education is a hard place. If I wanted my best bet to have, I've got one $100 million company. If I wanted another one, AI for test prep. I could get the funding for it tomorrow, and we could be well over 100 million, you know, how far as I can get, we could net 100 million 2-3 years from now. And I would change absolutely no one's life. So one of the problems right now in education in particular, but not uniquely in that, is there's bad market alignment between what people really need and what you can get investment for, what you can get into the market with. The problem isn't what's the right thing to change kids. When you do it from an entrepreneurial standpoint, the question is, what will people buy? You can tell a teacher you will change the life outcomes of their kids, or you could tell them, I'm going to cut your grading time in half. Guess which of those products you will sell. So this is sort of brutal reality. I haven't gone into the entrepreneurial side of this, but there's a brutal reality to that. And you need to figure out how to bake your brownie, your broccoli into a brownie, and really preserve as much nutritional value as you can, but solve the problem they will actually buy. Or you just do what I do, and you pay for it all yourself, and you do crazy stuff, and fools show up at your talks and think that you're going to tell them something special. So it's a challenging question, and the simple truth is, globally, formal education is very risk-averse and very slow-moving. You will not show magical changes, so we look at other things. Can I help parents directly work with their kids? I have exactly such a product on the market right now. Can I find other people that have that long-term stakeholder status? Well, to be perfectly honest, if you think you're going to have someone on staff for 30 years, You kind of care about the direction their life is going. Ironically, that means not tech companies, but crazily, places like ExxonMobil that think you're still a newbie until you've been there for 5 years. So interestingly, we find stakeholders that have long-term interests, and we can find some alignment there. Schools have been really hard to work with. But even there are some specific places. Okay, clearly I am simply just stopping, but I think that's probably necessary. You all need to go get drunk somewhere now. So I think I probably have like a final quote or something. We'll skip that. There you go. It's my quote from earlier today. And I'm going to leave you with this final idea. Forgive me if you were in the audience earlier today, but what do I mean by this? What do I mean that technology should challenge us? So I'm going to give you a prediction. I'm a neuroscientist. I'm not a futurist, but this is something I am very confident in. In 20 to 30 years, we will see a rather profound uptick in early onset dementia. Why? You think I'm going to tell a story about social networking or something, and I'm not, although really very possibly. No, I'm sticking with something I know. We know, one of those causal things, we know navigating through space is prophylactic against cognitive decline. Well, I don't do that. I use my phone. Google Maps does all my navigating. It does my navigating in Shenzhen until I got kicked off. I got kicked off of WeChat. I don't know what I did. I didn't do anything. I did it to get over here. I did it to now. I'm in new cities all the time. Of course I need it. I am better. I will say I'm genuinely better when I'm using Google Maps. But I'm actually worse than when I started. It's a small effect, but it will accumulate across my lifetime, as it will for all of you, and it will cost us. If you're thinking, I want to solve a big, meaningful problem, be certain you understand that problem. Technology is not a solution. It's not the problem either. It's just a tool. AI is not magic. It's neither the solution or the problem. It's just a tool. I already told you, there are only human problems, and there are only human solutions, and you will only ever solve them if you go deep and understand those. Then the world will open up. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Vivienne Ming, for the very interesting and informative talk. So you can find out more events by SG Innovate at sginnovate.com. You can also talk to us on our social media channels. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And if I may direct attention to the back where there's a Humans of SG Innovate board there, you can leave us a post-it note and tell us how you feel. Thank you.